Introduction. Imagine a cold morning in the north, when the sea is covered with a light mist and a ship, barely distinguishable against the grey waves, struggles against a raging storm. One of the ancient sagas, passed from mouth to mouth around campfires, tells the story of Ragnar, Lothbrok's great raid. According to the legend, when the northern wind howled in such a way that the very soul of the sea seemed to cry out for revenge, Ragnar and his warriors, driven not only by courage, but also by faith in the destiny of their people, set out into the open sea. Their carved draggers sailed through the storm, reflecting the same inexorable nature as the elements. At that moment, every wave crash, every rumble of thunder and flash of lightning spoke of how life in this world is a constant test, where fortitude and determination become more important than death itself. Ragnar, as if a harbinger of future changes, foresaw that his people would one day become not only fierce warriors, but also skillful traders, explorers, creators of myths that would live in the memory of people for centuries. This is how the legend of the Vikings was born, a people who feared neither the elements nor fate, and whose feats and tragedies were reflected in songs and runic inscriptions, preserving the spirit of ancient times. Greetings, my dear friends. Today we are going on a journey through the world of the Vikings to try to understand who they really were. We will be looking for answers to the questions. Who were these people who lived in the harsh conditions of Scandinavia? What were their customs, life and value system, and why their image, so romanticized in movies and literature, is far from the reality? This lecture will help you separate myths from facts and look at the Vikings not as ruthless brigands, but as a people whose way of life, culture, and even faith were full of contradictions and deep humanity. Immerse yourself in this history with us to not only hear tales of bloody raids and great sea campaigns, but also to understand how the Vikings, who lived in harsh conditions, left an indelible mark on history and culture. This lecture is an invitation to reflect on what it means to be human in a world where the boundaries between myth and reality are so thin that sometimes you have to search for answers to questions that have been asked for centuries. But who are the Vikings in terms of history? Harsh lands, cold winds, endless fjords dividing the coast into many secluded bays. Here, on the territory of present-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, those who would later be called Vikings originated. But in their heyday, Scandinavia was not the orderly kingdoms we know it to be today. It was a fragmented world of independent communities, each village or settlement living by its own laws, under the authority of a local lord or chief. Nature played a key role in the formation of this society. The land was far less fertile than southern Europe. Soil was scarce, and only narrow strips of land along the coast and rivers could be used for farming. The inland regions, covered with forests, mountains, and glaciers, were not favorable for the development of large settlements. In such conditions, people could not rely solely on agriculture. They had to find other ways of survival. Fishing, hunting, crafts, and, most importantly, maritime trade and raids became an important part of the life of these peoples. The coastline, riddled with many narrow fjords, contributed to keeping settlements small and isolated. Unlike the flat European states, where it was easy to travel by land, Scandinavia was much more convenient to travel by water. This produced a culture of excellence, seafarers. But geographic isolation had another side. In their own lands, the Scandinavians could not actively trade with each other because everyone had roughly the same things: fish, wood, and furs. All this encouraged them to go beyond their homelands in search of resources, goods, and wealth. The political structure of Scandinavia during this period was far from the centralized kingdoms of Europe. Power belonged to local chieftains and jarls who, they ruled their lands, assembled cohorts, and fought wars of influence. Large centers such as Uppsala in Sweden gradually became religious and administrative hubs, but there was no unified state. Instead, Scandinavia was a mosaic of chiefdoms, alliances, and small principalities where influence was spread through military power, wealth, and personal connections. The social structure of the Vikings was also quite flexible. Unlike feudal Europe, where people were born into a certain class and could rarely leave it, the Vikings had a more fluid system where personal achievements played an important role. Society was divided into free people, military elite, and slaves. Free people were the bulk of the population: farmers, craftsmen, traders, sailors. They could participate in assemblies, tings, where issues of war and peace were decided. Rulers were appointed and sentences were passed. The military elite, vigilantes, konungs, and jarls, rose from military successes and wealth gained in campaigns. This class was not closed, and any brave and skillful warrior could make his way to the top if he could prove his strength. Slaves, or thralls, were captured by the Vikings in raids and brought to their lands. It is known that during the exploration of Iceland in the 9th century, the Norwegians brought slaves with them, mostly from Celtic regions. They were used to work on farms, build ships, and other needs. Although the situation of the thralls was difficult, some of them were able to gain their freedom and even take their place among free people. Thus, Viking society combined a rigid hierarchy with the possibility of social mobility. Every man could take up arms and go on a raid to gain a new position, gold, and fame. It was this feature that allowed the Scandinavians to create a culture that combined a desire for conquest, a thirst for discovery, and a spirit of independence that would later lead them to explore new lands, from the shores of England to distant Vinland, an unknown land across the ocean. The Vikings are not a people. But what does it mean to be a Viking? Vikings are not a people, but rather a special social stratum and a way of life associated with sea voyages, trade, and military raids. If we are talking about nations, the ancestors of the Vikings were Scandinavians, the inhabitants of modern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. However, not all Scandinavians became Vikings. Most of the population in Scandinavia lived an ordinary life, grew crops, grazed cattle, built houses, made tools, and traded. Vikings were those who were temporarily or permanently engaged in sea voyages. The origin of the term Viking. The word Viking itself comes from the Old Scandinavian vikinga, which meant sea voyage or raid. In ancient texts you can find phrases like "he went Viking," which meant he went on a sea voyage. Interestingly, the word Viking is less common in Scandinavian sources than in foreign chronicles. For example, the English, French, and Arabs most often use the term to describe sea raiders coming from the north. In Arab chronicles, they were called Magyar or Rus, if it was about those who sailed on the rivers of Russia. In Byzantine sources, the word Varangians is found, so-called Scandinavian warriors hired in the service of emperors. Who could have been a Viking? To understand who the Vikings were, we need to visualize the social structure of Scandinavian society. Only free people, jarls, nobles, and carls, ordinary people, could become Vikings. But slaves, thralls, could not become Vikings because they had no personal freedom and no right to own weapons. Social strata of the Scandinavians in the Viking Age. First jarls, the highest stratum of society, rulers of lands, konungs, rich warriors, leaders of dot. They possessed ships, personal troops, and could organize raids. 2. The carls were free farmers, artisans, and traders. Some of them could go on raids or join their cohorts for booty and glory. They also formed the backbone of the population assistant. Third, thralls were slaves who were captured in raids. They could not participate. Campaigns because they had no freedom or rights. They were used for farm, labor, construction, and even sacrifices. Thus, not every inhabitant of Scandinavia was a Viking, but every Viking was a Scandinavian. The real life of the Scandinavians in the Viking Age. The Vikings were much more than just warriors who raided. Their lives were a complex interweaving of labor, mutual aid, and the constant struggle to survive in the harsh conditions of the northern lands. To truly understand who they were, we need to look at the daily life of the Scandinavians of that time, from fields to homes, from farm labor to family. Traditions. Most free people lived on small farms where agriculture was the basis of survival. Despite the harsh climate and scarce soil, the Scandinavians, they grew cereals, rye, barley, oats, and tried to make the most of every drop of land. Farmers worked not on holidays, but daily, tending small plots where each spring began with the preparation of the soil and each fall with the careful harvesting of the crops. After all, fertility was rare here, so labor on the land required special skill and diligence. In order to facilitate this labor, already in the 7th century, they began to use an iron plow, which made it possible to cultivate heavier and mineral-rich plots of land. The cattle breeding aspect of life was no less important. Livestock gave the Scandinavians not only food, but also the necessary materials: wool, leather, milk. Every household kept sheep, goats, cows, and pigs. Animals not only fed the families, but also helped in their daily work. They were used for transportation, working the land, and even as a source of heat on cold nights. It was this combination of farming and herding that allowed small communities to be self-sufficient, despite the hardships of the region. Scandinavian life centered around the longhouse, langhus, a traditional dwelling that housed all family members, servants, and even livestock. Conventional houses were rectangular, one-room houses built of wood, clay, and turf. Wealthy families could afford spacious, long houses divided into several zones with separate rooms for the master and servants. In Iceland and Greenland, where wood was scarce, houses were built of stone and peat, and roofs were covered with turf. The houses were always dark and smoky. The only source of light and heat was in the center, and smoke escaped through small holes in the roof. The houses in which the Scandinavians lived were a reflection of their way of life. In the harsh climate, Buildings were built to keep warm and provide protection from winds and precipitation. The living quarters were cramped, and even during festivals people shared a narrow space, which only strengthened kinship ties and a sense of community. Inside was a long hearth, around which the family gathered for meals, rest, and stories. Viking settlements were not cities with centralized government, but rather consisted of small villages scattered over hilly terrain and along the shores of fjords. These communities, isolated by natural barriers, mountains, rivers, fjords, developed independently of each other. Because of limited opportunities for internal trade, each village lived by its own laws, keeping in touch through local assemblies, the ting, where free men made important decisions. It was this fragmentation that contributed to each group being forced to seek new markets outside of their homelands, which eventually drove them to sea voyages and raids. The social structure of Scandinavian society was built on freedom and mutual aid. The basis was made up of free people, the bonds, who owned the land, managed the farms, and participated in public meetings. Their independence was so valuable that even if there were disputes between settlements, everything was decided at tings, where every word mattered. Unlike feudal Europe, there was no serfdom here. Every free man could protect his property and, if necessary, campaign for riches and glory. Women had a special place in this social system. Marriages were arranged, but women had the right to divorce. Women had the right to property and could manage the household, while the husband was on a campaign. Although historical sources often focused on the exploits of men, it was women who played a key role in keeping the community alive. They ran the houses, looked after the household, did the cooking and tete-a-tete, passing down traditions from generation to generation. Imagine an evening by the fireplace as an older woman with her deep voice and wisdom passes on to her children stories of ancestors, of great battles, and how family has always been and remains the mainstay in this cruel world. In the Scandinavian saga tradition, there are many legends of women who played a prominent role in the lives of their people. One of the most famous figures is Freydis, Eriksdottir, whose story from the Vinland sagas tells of her courage and determination, sometimes even credited with leadership qualities on expeditions across the ocean. She symbolizes the idea that women could be just as brave and determined as their men. The sagas also often mention Odd Deep, known as one of Iceland's first and most influential settlers. Her story reflects not only the hardships of life that the Scandinavians faced, but also the wisdom that was passed down from generation to generation. Aud was able to maintain her independence despite harsh conditions and to become the center of the family and community, a testament to the importance of the female role in this society. Other examples include Gunhild, called the Mother of Kings, whose fate is described in various saga chronicles, where she appears as a powerful figure who could influence the course of historical events. Although these stories may be mythologized, they reflect the cultural values of the era and show that women in Scandinavian society were able to wield power, autonomy, and influence decision-making. Thus, legends about women in the saga tradition not only tell of heroic deeds, but also show that the Vikings valued in their societies not only military strength, but also wisdom, household management skills, family ties, and the ability to lead the people in difficult times. These stories help us understand that behind the romanticized image of the Vikings lies a multifaceted heritage where women played an important role in shaping and preserving. Cultural traditions. Scandinavian society was built on the principle of freedom, where every man could take up arms and, if he saw fit, go on a quest for wealth and glory. But freedom in this society did not only mean the ability to participate in raids and battles. It meant the ability to independently, too, manage one's own affairs and to take part in public meetings where the fate of the whole community was decided. It was because of this arrangement that even small groups of free people could survive and develop in the harsh conditions of the northern lands, where climate and geography dictated their own laws. However, trade between the different settlements was rather limited. Because of the abundance of similar resources, fish, wood, furs, and because of the geographical fragmentation, with fjords and mountains separating one village from another, it was difficult to establish a large-scale exchange of goods within Scandinavia. Each village lived according to its own laws, and although there was contact between them, it was more in the nature of exchange than centralized trade. This contributed to people seeking new markets outside their homelands, which eventually pushed them to sea voyages and raids abroad. The Scandinavians lacked many goods, such as wine, silver, spices, and expensive fabrics. All these things were brought in by traders. The Vikings traded with England, France, Russia, and the Arab countries. Byzantine merchants exchanged silk for furs, francs, exchanged swords for slaves. Arab merchants brought silver coins, which the Scandinavians used instead of their own money. Along with trade and warfare, the Vikings practiced crafts. Craftsmen made clothes, weapons, and utensils, passing their skills from generation to generation. Their creations were not only utilitarian, but also aesthetically pleasing, reflecting a love of nature and respect for tradition. Each thing, whether a simple knife or an elegant piece of jewelry, was imbued with meaning and history, allowing people to feel connected to the past and their ancestors. Strength, skill, and courage were intertwined with a deep respect for the sea and nature. Born in the harsh Scandinavian lands, these people not only wielded swords, but also possessed unique skills in building ships capable of navigating raging seas and narrow fjords, conducting precise raids and returning home unharmed. One of the key factors that allowed the Vikings to stay ahead of their contemporaries was their approach to shipbuilding. While other peoples relied on simple boats, the Vikings created true masterpieces of engineering. Their ships, drakkers and nors, were masterpieces of shipbuilding. Drakkers were long, narrow, with a high bow decorated with carved patterns, which not only gave them an intimidating appearance, but also improved hydrodynamic properties. These vessels were built from the finest wood, often pine or spruce, and woodworking techniques were passed down from generation to generation. Every element, from the hull to the mast, was created with great precision and attention to detail, because any mistake could cost a life during a long voyage on rough seas. Nors, more spacious and cargo-loaded, served for the transportation of goods and people. Their construction was characterized by strength and capacity, which allowed the Vikings not only to raid, but also to establish trade with distant countries. These ships were a kind of mobile cities, where the gathered knowledge of shipbuilding and navigation enabled them to travel great distances. The Vikings also had unique navigational skills. Life at sea made them develop an intuitive understanding of nature. They determined their location by the stars, by the movement of clouds, by changes in wind and currents. For them, the sea was an open book that they could read. Even without modern instruments, they found their way through fogs and rough waters, using natural landmarks that to others seemed elusive. This skill allowed them not only to raid successfully, but also to return home, despite all the unpredictability of sea. Travel. Viking military tactics are also noteworthy. Their strategies were based speed, surprise, and mobility. Unlike the large armies of medieval Europe, which lined up in dense rows, the Vikings acted like lightning. They gathered in small groups, quickly crossed the sea, attacked, then just as quickly disappeared into the labyrinths of fjords or dense forests. This tactic allowed them to deliver crushing blows to their enemies and get away, leaving no opportunity to retaliate. That is why, despite their apparent brutality, they were often forced to negotiate. Their opponents realized that in open combat the Vikings were almost invincible, and a compromise solution was often less costly. Despite their fighting power and superiority in shipbuilding, the Vikings did not always win. Conflicts. Their society was fragmented. Each group acted independently, and there was not always centralized leadership between them. This created internal strife and meant that sometimes even the most skillful warriors could not unite forces for a unified offensive. Because of this, it was sometimes possible to negotiate with the enemy, make a truce, or divide the spoils without prolonged bloody clashes. This system, based on personal honor, mutual obligations, and the pursuit of gain, made them not unconditional conquerors, but rather a group of free men who used sea voyages as a means of enrichment and self-expression. The technical details behind their ships were also of the utmost importance. Each ship was built by hand, and every detail, from the bending of the hull to the choice of fasteners, was the result of centuries of experience. The Vikings used a special method of fastening planks, the so-called spike joint, which allowed them to create a flexible but strong structure that could withstand the strong blows of waves and winds. The efficient use of sail, first introduced in these lands, gave them the ability to significantly increase their range. This enabled their ships to embark on long expeditions, covering not only Europe, but also lands that could only be dreamed of before. Another important aspect is the mentality and culture of the Vikings. They lived in a world where every action was judged by its effectiveness and benefit to the community. Honor, personal bravery, and the pursuit of freedom were the main values. Saga tales told stories of great campaigns where warriors fought not only for the wealth, but also for their independence. Their success at sea was a reflection of their inner strength, determination, and aspiration for a better life. Introduction. From military exploits to myths. Why did the Vikings need gods? When we talk about the Vikings, we immediately conjure up the image of rugged seafarers, riding on drakars to new lands, fearsome warriors whose swords cut through slender ranks of enemies. Their raids covered Europe, Russia, even the Middle East. They robbed, traded, conquered, created settlements, and left a trace in history. But behind their martial glory lay something much deeper, a question that is rarely asked. What gave the Vikings the strength to throw themselves into the unknown, to risk their lives without fear of death. The answer lies in their faith. The gods were not just myths, they were part of every Viking's reality. They explained the structure of the world, justified military exploits, determined fate, and even gave hope after death. Faith in the gods did not just accompany their lives. It guided, helped them cope with danger, and gave meaning to a cruel world. Unlike the more organized Christian religions, the Vikings did not have a single scripture or strict tenets. Their faith was passed down by word of mouth in sagas, in the songs of schools, in legends told around the campfire on long winter evenings. These stories explained everything from the change of day and night to the causes of sea storms, but most importantly, they taught how a man should live his life so that his name would live on. Through the ages, the Vikings believed that the world was organized according to certain laws. Life is not infinite, and the end is inevitable. But you can make your destiny become legendary. This is why their culture was permeated with the notion of glory, bravery, and destiny. Death on the battlefield was not considered a tragedy, but a reward. After all, fallen warriors were taken to Valhalla, Odin's vast attic, where they feast forever, preparing for the last battle of the world, Ragnarok. But where did such a belief come from? Why was nothing more important to the Vikings than fate? What was their picture of the world? To understand this, we need to look into their mythology, into that magical, cruel, beautiful world where the god of thunder Thor fights. Giants, where Odin, who gave his eye for wisdom, weaves a web of destinies, where Loki plays with fire and the goddess Freya takes away the fallen on the battlefield. It was this belief that gave the Vikings meaning, the meaning to fight, to win, to die, and to remain in the memory of descendants. Now let us understand how exactly they imagined the world, who ruled it, and what laws dictated the fate of people. The ancient Scandinavians did not know that the earth was a ball revolving around the sun. They could not explain the change of seasons through the tilt of the earth's axis, and storms through pressure differences. Their world consisted not of continents and oceans, but of 9 different worlds connected by invisible paths, and at the center of this universe stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, the oldest and mightiest ash tree, holding the entire universe on its branches. Yggdrasil was not just a symbol of life, it was life itself. Its branches reached upward, holding the world of the gods, and its roots reached deep into the darkness, linking the living and the dead, the past and the future. This tree carried the entire universe, but it was fragile, attacked by the forces of chaos, and would one day fall. The Vikings lived in a world that constantly balanced between order and destruction. They believed that nature was not stable, that summer would always replace by winter, that the sea could always throw a ship onto the rocks, that nothing lasted forever. Their view of the world was not comforting, but it made sense in this bleak world. Everything had order, even destruction. Yggdrasil is the axis of the universe. Yggdrasil connected all worlds. Its roots went in 3 different directions, feeding on the power of ancient springs. Under one of the roots was the Well of Erd, the dwelling place of the Norns, the 3 goddesses of fate. They wove the threads of each creature's life, determining its birth, its path, and its inevitable end. Their decisions were final, and even the gods themselves could not change the fate written by the Norns. The second route led to Niflheim, a world of cold, ice, and eternal darkness. There was a source of primordial power, whose waters could give life but also take it away. The third route stretched to Jotunheim, the land of the giants. These creatures were older than the gods and were the bearers of primordial chaos. They were not only evil or only good, they were simply another force in the world. But even such a great tree was not invulnerable. In its roots lurked the serpent Nidug, gnawing at its base. The branches of the tree suffered from the deer that devoured its leaves, and in the crown lived an eagle that feuded with the dragon in the roots. This meant that even the world itself was in a state of slow destruction. The world was not limited to the land of men. The universe consisted of 9 worlds, each with its own purpose and inhabitants. Asgard is the world of the Aesir gods, the world of Odin, Thor, and other gods ruling the universe. This world was surrounded by walls and connected to the world of men through the Bifrost, a rainbow bridge. Vanaheim is the abode of the Vans, ancient fertility gods associated with natural magic. The Aesir and the Vanir were once at war with each other, but then they made peace and began to live together. Midgard is the world of men, surrounded by an endless ocean in which hid Jormungand, the world serpent, coiling the earth and holding it in its rings. Jotunheim was a land of giants, creatures who could be both enemies and allies of the gods. The great river Iving separated this world from Asgard. Alfheim is the luminous world of the Alves, beautiful beings who, according to some beliefs, resembled nature spirits. Svartalfheim is the realm of the dwarves, skilled blacksmiths who created magical artifacts, including Thor's hammer. Muspelheim is a world of fire, home to the fire giants led by Surt. It is from here that the world will one day be destroyed. Niflheim is the world of eternal ice, one of the oldest worlds that existed before the gods. Helheim is the realm of the dead, where Hel, Loki's daughter, ruled. All those who died not in battle, but from disease or old age, went there. The Vikings did not have science in the modern sense, but they sought to understand the world which they lived. Everything they observed was explained through myths. Thunder and lightning, that's Thor swinging his hammer in the sky, fighting giants. A storm on the sea, that's the serpent Jormungand stirring in the ocean. The change of day and night. They are 2 riders, the sun and the moon, who are being chased by the giant wolves Skoll and Hati. One day they will catch up with their prey, and then the world will end. Why does the earth sometimes tremble? Loki, chained to a rock, writhing in agony as the snake's poison drips on his face. Even the birth of the world was explained through the struggle of the elements. In the beginning, there was nothing but the void of Ginnungagap, divided into 2 opposite edges. The world of eternal fire, Muspelheim, and the world of eternal ice, Niflheim. When ice met, flame, from their collision, was born the giant Ymir, from whose body the gods then created the earth. But the Viking world doesn't last forever. One day there will come a day when Yggdrasil will shudder. The worlds will meet in a final battle, and the entire universe will be destroyed. It will be Ragnarok, the fateful battle between the gods and the forces of chaos. Then the wolf Fenrir will break free of his chains and swallow the sun. Thor will kill, but he will fall from his poison. Odin will fight Fenrir, but will be defeated. The fiery giant Surt will raise his flaming sword and burn the world. But this is not the end. From the ashes of the old world, a new world will be born. 2. Humans, Liv and Livtrasir, will survive the catastrophe and repopulate the earth. And the surviving gods will build a new world, free from the old mistakes. The Viking faith was harsh and rigid, like their world itself. They knew that the universe did not last forever, that everything had its time, but that was no reason for despair. On the contrary, it was an incentive to live so that you would be remembered. In their world, fate was predetermined, but everyone chose the path to it himself. It was possible to face death with fear, and it was possible to face it with weapons in hand, with a smile in the face of fate. Now that we understand how the Vikings represented the universe, let's look into what gods ruled this world and what role they played in the lives of the ancient Scandinavians. Viking gods, a reflection of their world, fears and values. The Vikings believed that behind their world was a powerful pantheon of gods, each of whom embodied certain forces of nature, human traits, and ideals to aspire to. The Viking. Gods were not omnipotent and sinless. On the contrary, they made mistakes, fought, died, and committed acts peculiar to mortals. They did not just rule the world, they lived in it, fought for their place, made alliances and feuds, and thus were close and understandable to their followers. The gods personified the most important spheres of Viking life. If you are a warrior, your hopes turn to Odin and Thor. If you are a seafarer, to Njord. If you are a farmer, to Freya. The pantheon of Scandinavian gods was not chaotic, but reflected the structure of Viking life itself. The struggle with nature, military campaigns, belief in fate and fear of death. Odin is wisdom, warfare, and the quest for knowledge. Odin was the supreme god, but his power was not given to him for nothing. He was not a kind creator or a just judge. He was a god of war, magic, and wisdom who sought to learn all the secrets of the universe. He gave his eye to drink from the fountain of wisdom, sacrificed himself by hanging on. Yggdrasil for 9 days to learn the secrets of the runes, and did not fear even the doomed battle of Ragnarok. He was accompanied by 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, who flew around the world every day bringing him news. In battle, his army consisted of berserk, warriors who fell into a fierce battle frenzy. Odin chose the best of the fallen in battle and took them to Valhalla, where they feasted in preparation for the final battle of the gods. But Odin was more than just a patron of war. He was cunning, calculating, ready to make any sacrifice for the sake of knowledge. The Vikings saw in him the ideal of a ruler, not just strong but wise, someone who could lead. Thor is the protector of men and the enemy of giants. Thor was a pure power, the protector of the human world. His symbol was the hammer, Mjolnir, which smashed giants and returned to its owner after a throw. Unlike Odin, Thor was not cunning. He did not make devious plans or weave intrigues, but dealt with the matters straightforwardly. If there was a threat, it had to be destroyed. The Vikings believed that it was he who protected them from giants and chaos, and that thunderstorms were the echoes of his battles. But he was not only the god. Freya is the goddess of love, magic, and war. She was both the goddess of love, fertility, and witchcraft, but also the goddess of war. Half of all those who fell in battle were sent not to Valhalla, but to her abode, Folkwang. She was the patron saint of women, but her power was not limited to family and home. She knew said, the powerful magic of fate, which she had taught even Odin. She could control events and predict the future. Freya was one of the Van, the ancient gods whom the Aesir accepted into their pantheon. After the war, this emphasized the Vikings' complex relationship with the forces of nature and their respect for magic. Loki is the god of cunning, destruction, and change. There was no absolute evil among the Viking gods, but if anyone was suitable for the role of destroyer, it was Loki. He was not a god in the usual sense. He was considered a cunning creature who traveled between worlds. Loki was a master of deception. He could save the gods, or he could betray them. He helped Thor to get back the stolen hammer, but it was because of him that Balder died. He gave birth to terrible creatures, the world serpent Jörmungand, the wolf Fenrir, and the goddess of death Hel. But without Loki, Viking mythology would not be complete. He personified chaos, change, and destruction. Without him, there would have been no Ragnarok, but without him, there would have been no many great feats. Njord is the god of the sea and trade. For the people living by the sea, not only the god of war, but also the god who ruled the waves was most important. Njord was such a deity, the patron of sailors, fishermen, and merchants. He was not of the Aesir, but of the Van, the gods of nature. But after the war between the Aesir and the Van, he was admitted to Asgard. His children, Freya and Freyr, were also honored, but he himself remained a symbol of calm seas and successful trade. Vikings, setting sail, often made sacrifices to him to get a tailwind and avoid storms. Hel is the ruler of the world of the dead. Only those who fell with weapons in their hands went to Valhalla. But what happened to the others? They went to the realm of Hel, Loki's daughter, who ruled over the cold and gloomy underworld. Hel was half alive, half dead, and her realm was not hell in the Christian sense. It was simply a world where the dead lived, those who deserved neither glory nor damnation. The Vikings were not afraid of hell, but preferred not to think about it. For them, there was no more terrible fate than to die not in battle and not to go to Valhalla or Folkwang. Gods as a reflection of Viking life. The Viking pantheon is not just a collection of ancient myths. It is a reflection of the world in which they lived. Odin symbolized the wisdom and cunning needed by rulers. Thor symbolized strength and honor, which warriors should possess. Freya united female magic and military valor, and Loki reminded that chaos is part of life. But most importantly, they were all mortal. Odin would fall in Ragnarok, Thor would die. Fighting the serpent, even the world would burn in fire. This spoke of the Vikings' main fear: nothing lasts forever, not even the gods themselves. In their world, everyone had to leave a mark to earn their place in history. The gods were strong, but they did not save people. They gave an example: how to fight, how to seek, knowledge, how to protect their own and not be afraid of the end. Now that we know who ruled the world, let's look at what rituals and ceremonies the Vikings performed to honor their gods and ancestors. Magic, sacrifice, and a way into another world. How the Vikings communicated with the gods. In a world where everyone's fate was sealed and the gods were powerful but vulnerable, the Vikings sought to find ways to influence the will of the higher powers. They brought generous gifts to the gods, sought predictions, used magic, and composed runes to strengthen their connection to the beyond. The life of a Scandinavian was full of dangers: wars, famine, storms, bad harvests. Everything depended on the favor of the gods. But how do you earn it? How do you show that you are worthy of their favor? The answer was simple. A gift requires a gift. If you want Thor to protect your home, bring him the best you have. If you ask Odin for wisdom, be prepared to sacrifice much, even yourself. Blood sacrifices to the gods. One of the most important Viking rites was the blot, a sacrifice to the gods. It could be modest, the pouring of beer or honey on the ground, or majestic, when animals and sometimes people were sacrificed. The biggest festivals were held in Uppsala, one of the main religious centers, every 9 years, people from all over Scandinavia gathered here, and the gods received gifts, 9 men and 9 animals of each kind. They were hung sacred trees, letting their blood flow into the earth to energize it, propitiate the gods, and ensure fertility. But how massive were the human casualties? Contrary to common myths, such rituals were not an everyday practice. Archaeological finds and written sources show that these were rare events that occurred on special occasions, during wars, disasters, or in honor of important leaders. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan in the 10th century described how his slave girl was burnt. Together with a dead noble warrior, she first took part in the ritual actions, then she was killed and put into a funeral ship, sending her to the other world after her master. Adam of Bremen, 11th century, mentioned that people were sacrificed in the temple of Uppsala by hanging them from trees. However, modern historians dispute the reliability of this testimony. Perhaps he was just passing on rumors. Scandinavian sagas also describe instances of human sacrifice. The saga of the Ynglings tells us that the Swedish Konung Domaldi was killed and sacrificed when the country suffered from crop failures. Archaeologists have found remains of people in Denmark, Bogenholm, who may have been ritually killed, drowned, or hanged. But still, the basis of Viking religious rituals was animal sacrifice: bulls, horses, rams. Their blood was collected in bowls and sprinkled on temples and idols, and the meat was then eaten during the feast. This was a symbol of the union between people and gods. Sacrifices were also left in the water. Archaeologists find weapons, gold, and animal bones at the bottom of ancient lakes. Perhaps the Vikings tried to propitiate the spirits of nature in this way: cider, magic, prophecies, and witches. But how do you know what gifts the gods are waiting for? How do you see into the future? The answer was the magic of the cider. It was the art of prophecy, sorcery, and controlling fate. Freya, the goddess of love, magic, and war, knew it. Those who could weave fates could change the course of events, cast spells, see the future, and even bring calamities. The most famous prophetesses were the vulva, women initiated into the secrets of magic. They wandered from village to village, fell into a trance, and told people their fate. But Viking magic was not only a woman's craft. Men too could wield saber, but it was considered shameful, for such practices were closely linked to the feminine. Even Odin was ridiculed for comprehending this power, but continued to use it, realizing that knowledge is more important than pride. Runes, the magic of writing and signs. Runes were not just letters, they contained power. According to myth, Odin discovered the secret of the runes on the tree Yggdrasil and passed them on to people. Vikings carved runic inscriptions on stones, weapons, amulets, believing that they protect, strengthen the strength of the warrior, keep the memory of ancestors. Some runes were used for magical purposes. They could bring good luck, ward off trouble, strengthen. Morale. Sometimes runes were put on swords to make them thirsty for blood. Warriors believed that a sword engraved with sacred signs would not fail in battle. Funeral rites, how the dead were seen off. Death did not mean the end. It was only a passage to another world. The Vikings believed that one's fate after death depended on how one lived. The most noble and powerful warriors received ship burials. They were burned together with the ship because it was supposed to take them to the other world. If a Viking was buried in the ground, he was often placed in a rook, covering the top with earth so that it would remain his companion forever. Archaeologists have found such burials, for example, the famous Oseberg ship in Norway. In it, they found the remains of a noble woman buried with rich gifts, fabrics, jewelry, wagons, and even animals. Not everyone was buried in the same way. Those who died of old age or disease went to the realm of hell, cold and gloomy. Only those who had fallen in battle could hope for a place in Valhalla or Folkwang. To keep the dead from returning, their graves were sometimes surrounded by stone rings or their belongings were burned. The Vikings believed that if the dead were not satisfied, they could return in the form of a draga, the living dead tormenting the living. Death is not the end, but the beginning. Magic, sacrifices, runes, it was all part of Viking life. They didn't fear the gods, but they didn't rely on their favor for nothing. The world was harsh, and if you wanted the gods to help, you had to prove yourself worthy of their attention. Now that we have learned how the Vikings communicated with higher powers, let's look into their tales, for it is the myths and sagas that have preserved for us their world, their dreams, their fears. Myths and sagas as a reflection of Viking life. When the long northern nights covered the land with darkness, when the fire in the hearth crackled, casting bizarre shadows on the walls, then the stories began. Old men, grey-haired, guardians of the past, passed on to the young stories of gods, heroes, betrayals, and great feats. These stories, sagas, were not just entertainment. They held the memory of their ancestors, explained the laws of the world, and taught what it meant to be a Viking. Unlike the Romans or Greeks, the Vikings did not record their history in books. Their memory lived on in an oral tradition, the sagas. These tales told of great conquerors of distant lands, of brave warriors finding glory or meeting their destiny. The Vikings did not believe in chance. For them, every man, every god followed the path laid out by the Norns, the goddesses of fate. That is why the sagas so often contain the motif of inevitability. You can try to avoid the predictions as much as you like, but sooner or later, they will come true anyway. The sagas praised courage, honor, and loyalty to one's clan, but also told of guile, treachery, and punishment for transgressions. These stories taught that honor was paramount, that a true warrior should not fear death, and that cunning without honor leads to failure point. But even the strongest of Vikings could not defeat fate, and the stories of the gods themselves were a reminder of that. Thor and his battles with giants. The Vikings loved Thor, the god of thunder, the protector of people. They considered Odin to be the god of wisdom and cunning, while Thor was the god of simplicity, strength, and justice. He did not plot, he did not seek secrets. He struck with his hammer and crushed his enemies. In one of the most famous stories, Thor is stolen his hammer Mjolnir, a terrible weapon, without which the god can protect neither people nor Asgard. It turns out that the hammer has been stolen by the giant Trim, and he demands the goddess Freya as his wife in exchange for it. Freya refuses, and then Loki, a cunning and deceitful man, offers a trick to dress Thor in a wedding dress and give him away as a bride. The giant throws a feast, but when the bride sits down at the table, she eats 8 huge salmon and drinks 3 barrels of honey. The hold is surprised, but Loki explains she's so excited she hasn't eaten in a week. When the hammer is brought for the wedding ceremony, Thor grabs it and in anger destroys the giants. This story is not just a joke. It shows that even the strongest warrior can't always do it alone. Sometimes you need cunning. Sometimes you need the help of friends. But the main thing is to always be ready to get your weapon back and fight back against your enemies. Loki is the trickster who brought the gods to ruin. Loki was special. He was neither good nor evil. He was cunning, dangerous, and unpredictable. He helped the gods, but he also destroyed their world. There are many stories about him. He saved the gods from trouble, invented incredible tricks, but he was often the culprit of misfortune himself. The Vikings knew that life is not all white and black. Every hero has a bit of traitor in him, and every enemy has a bit of friend in him. But Loki's most terrible act was killing Balder. Balder's tragedy is a symbol of the inevitability of fate. Balder was a beautiful and kind god, loved by all. His mother, the goddess Frigg, wanting to protect her son, took an oath from every creature in the world that they would not harm him. Everyone except the small, insignificant plant, mistletoe. Loki found out about it, and when the gods were having fun throwing stones and spears at Balder, which could not hurt him, he discreetly put an arrow made of mistletoe into the hands of the blind god Herd. Herd fired, and Balder fell dead. The gods were terrified. They went to hell in the underworld, asking her to bring Balder back. She agreed, but only if the whole world mourned for him. All the creatures cried, except for one old woman. That was Loki in disguise. So Balder remained in the realm of the dead, and the gods realized nothing can be changed. Fate is stronger than even themselves. This story taught Vikings resilience. If death is inevitable, meet it with honor. Gods who could not save themselves. The Vikings did not believe in eternal, all-powerful gods. They knew that even the strongest could fall. Odin will be devoured by the wolf Fenrir at the end of time. Thor protected the people, but during Ragnarok, he will be killed by the poison of the serpent Jormungand. Even Loki will. Meet his fate. His son will kill the god Heimdall, but will fall by his blade. The world created by the gods will be destroyed, but from its ashes a new one will rise, and there, among fresh grass and clear waters, men and young gods will reappear. Why did the Vikings see the world this way? For the Vikings, life was a struggle, with the sea, with enemies, with hunger. Their myths taught them that even if you cannot change your fate, you can meet it with dignity. The gods, so powerful and great, ended up being no stronger than fate itself. But while they lived, they fought, they rejoiced, they feasted. So it was with the Vikings. They knew that one day their days would end, but until that day came, they lived life to the fullest. Their sagas and myths are not just stories about the gods. They are the story of themselves, influence on Europe, and the end of an era. The Viking Age, spanning from the attack on St. Cuthbert's Monastery on Lindisfarne in 793 to the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, remains one of the most colourful and controversial periods in European history. In those days, the natives of the rugged Scandinavian lands exerted enormous influence on the politics and economy of a vast region, from the shores of Scandinavia to North Africa, from the Volga River to the shores of North America. Even the Catholic Church included in its liturgical rites a formula calling for the Normans to be spared from the wrath of the Normans, which speaks to how these people were perceived by their contemporaries as a serious, pervasive threat. But who are the Vikings really? The answer is not as simple as it may seem at first glance. The Vikings were not a single people or ethnic group, but were disparate, often independent, communities united by a common way of life. They were people for whom sea voyages, raids, trade, and exploration were a way of surviving in a limited environment. The resources of their native Scandinavia. It was this way of life that enabled them to conquer new lands, open trade routes, and influence the course of history. Ragnar Lothbrok is one of the most famous names in the sagas and legends. His figure is shrouded in many myths. Popular lore attributes him with leading the army that captured and burned Paris in 845. His nickname, Leatherpants, is said to be linked to childhood stories, while another legend claims that he was immune to snake venom, a certain image that gave him almost superhuman qualities. However, like many other figures of this time, Ragnar Lothbrok remains a semi-legendary character, and the accuracy of his biography is difficult to ascertain. His fate ended tragically. According to legend, he was thrown into a pit of poisonous snakes, which became a symbol of imminent retribution for the cruelty of the raids. Björn of Ironclad, who led an expedition to the Mediterranean, was an equally colourful figure. Legends tell how his party passed through the Strait of Gibraltar and raided territories, stretching from Morocco to Italy, even reaching Pisa. This shows that the Vikings were not limited raiding nearby lands. They sought discovery and trade even in such remote regions, demonstrating amazing skill in shipbuilding and maritime navigation. Another notable Viking was Ivar the Boneless, one of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons. His nickname, Boneless, raises many questions. Some speculate that he may have had a congenital disease related to brittle bones, which made him physically less powerful, but compensated for his sharp mind and tactical abilities. Along with his brother Halfdan, he led the great pagan army that invaded England. These events left a deep mark on history, becoming a symbol of how Vikings could unite for large-scale military campaigns. Halfdan, like his brother, played an important role in the campaigns of conquest. His name is often mentioned in legends as an integral part of the great pagan army, which managed to capture a large part of England. His deeds complete the image of the Vikings as not only bloodthirsty brigands, but also as organized warriors capable of strategic decisions and building tactically calibrated offensives. Among other famous figures, one cannot fail to mention Rollo the pedestrian. The legends about him are filled with epic images. It is said that he led a large army that besieged Paris in 885. His figure is noted for his extraordinary size. It is said that no horse could carry him, giving him an almost mythical status. Roland later became the first Duke of Normandy after concluding a peace treaty with the King of France. One amusing legend recounts how he refused to kiss the king's feet, instructing one of his men to do so, with the result that the king was overturned. This anecdote illustrates not only his greatness, but also a character that commanded respect and apprehension. Rurik, according to tradition, was invited by the inhabitants of Novgorod in 862, when they expelled the previous rulers. He is considered the founder of the Rurikovich dynasty, who ruled Russia for centuries. Rurik's name is said to be derived from the Scandinavian Rorik, indicating his cultural heritage. His reign laid the foundations of the state system in the East, showing how Viking influence extended far beyond Scandinavia. Harald the Fierce, or Hardrada, also figures prominently in the legends of the Viking Age. He undertook an ambitious invasion of England in 1066, although he was defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Despite his failure, his campaign left an indelible mark on history. His experience and determination have been the subject of numerous accounts emphasizing that even the greatest military campaigns can end tragically. Finally, one cannot fail to mention William the Conqueror, a descendant of Rollo. His conquest of England in 1066 changed the course of history, and he came to symbolize the Norman Viking heritage. Although his image is often associated with conquest, it is important to realize that his success was the result of centuries of accumulated knowledge and tradition embedded in Scandinavian culture. These names, Ragnar Lothbrok, Björn the Ironclad, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Rollo, Rurik, Harald the Fierce, and William the Conqueror, reflect the diversity of the Viking Age. Their deeds, woven into the legends, not only testify to their military might, but also show how Scandinavian influence spread throughout Europe and beyond. Modern sources and sagas often intertwine facts with myths, creating an image of the Vikings as bloodthirsty barbarians. But in reality, it was a complex and multifaceted period where conquest was combined with trade, cultural exchange, and even elements of popular self-government. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were explorers, traders, and creators of new history. The Catholic Church, appalled by their raids, even included in the liturgy a call to deliver from the fury of the Normans, a testament to how much they influenced people's lives in those times. Thus, the myths and legends of the great Vikings, with their fantastic feats, allow us to look into the past and understand how these individuals, acting under the conditions of harsh nature and constant struggle for survival, were able to leave an indelible mark in history. Their deeds, passed down from generation to generation, serve as a reminder that behind every myth is a real story, the story of a people who, despite all the difficulties, managed to build a unique society and change the world around them. The decline of the Viking Age, how the rugged seafarers disappeared from the historical scene. But nothing lasts forever. not even the eras of great conquerors. The Vikings were the storm of European shores, the dreaded dream of kings, a legend in their lifetime. But time, inexorably, and the moment came when the fierce nation that shook medieval Europe itself changed beyond recognition. What led to their disappearance? Why did their world, based on bravery, navigation, and war, give way to kingdoms, laws, and the Christian cross? The northern world was pagan. Its gods demanded strength, blood, and sacrifice. However, with each passing year, the influence of Christianity penetrated more deeply. The first blow came from the south. By the time the Vikings began their raids on Christian monasteries, Christianity was already firmly established in Europe. But while the Vikings had seen the monasteries as rich stores of gold, a century later they saw something more: a new order, a new faith, and new opportunities. The adoption of Christianity among the Vikings did not happen overnight. It was a long process that affected different parts of Scandinavia in different ways. In Denmark, Harald the Strong-Toothed was the first of the conungs to be baptized and to declare his country Christian. Norway followed suit, but not willingly. King Olaf Tryggvason baptized the country by fire and sword, destroying pagan temples and executing those who opposed the new god. In the east, in the lands of Russia, the descendants of the Vikings also converted to the new faith. Prince Vladimir, the grandson of a Viking, chose Christianity and rejected the old gods. With faith came laws, a new morality, a new life. The Viking who had lived for glory was now a subject of the king and a servant of the church. The old Viking tradition was built on the strength of the clan, on vigilantes, on the right of the strong. But with Christianity came new ideas: a unified state, strict laws, royal power, backed by religion. Vikings used to be able to be free sea robbers, able to leave their home and go in search of glory and booty. But as kingdoms grew, things got more complicated. Now every warrior became a subject. He had to pay taxes, serve in the king's army, and follow his laws. Trade replaced raiding. Instead of plundering England, Denmark began trading alliances with it. Instead of destroying France, the Normans settled there, adopted its laws, and created the Duchy of Normandy. Vikings, who until recently were sea predators, became kings, knights, and traders. Vikings used to pillage monasteries, villages, and towns. But over time, fortresses grew stronger and armies grew stronger. Now you couldn't just dock at the shore and leave with the loot. In addition, new economic centers emerged. The Vikings had once controlled the trade, routes between east and west, but now Italian merchants had risen to prominence in the Mediterranean, and the powerful Hanseatic League had formed in Germany. The Vikings lost. Their monopolies and their world could no longer be built on war alone. History loves to turn the past into legend, but how real are our perceptions of the Vikings? Myth 1. Vikings wore horned helmets. In reality, no archaeologist has ever found battle helmets with horns. This image was invented by 19th century artists. Myth 2. The Vikings were only barbarians and robbers. Yes, they were warriors, but they were also traders, explorers, and statesmen. They founded cities, built trade routes, created laws. Myth 3. The Vikings disappeared suddenly. They didn't disappear, they changed. Their descendants ruled England, France, Sicily, Russia. They became part of the New World. The Viking Age is over, but its traces remain forever. Their descendants created great nations. Their sagas formed the basis of literature. Their ships have inspired generations of navigators. Their spirit lives on in culture, in movies, books, and legends. They no longer go to sea, no longer fight the kings of Europe, no longer fight under the banners of Odin. But their memory lives on. When you hear the waves crashing, when a storm rumbles through the sky, maybe it's an echo of distant times. Maybe somewhere in the depths of history, the songs of the Skalds still resound, telling of the glorious deeds of the northern seafarers. Our lecture has come to an end. Today, we travel together to the distant past, where drakars glided across the cold seas, where sagas of great heroes sounded, where Thor's thunderbolts rumbled and the fates of men and gods intertwined. May this evening be filled with peace, and your sleep be as deep as the northern fjords and as bright as the lights of the northern lights over the icy waters. May you dream of distant shores where brave Vikings sailed, sounds of old songs by the fire, warm flames of the hearth, warming you in the long polar night. Good night, and the most magical dreams, my dear friends. See you again.